to enter into universal history is to do this, is to, yeah, like involve yourself in this, yeah, this like social, the intercourse between like different nations.
I also think it's probably worth just to belabor the point a little bit. Engels and a lot of both the German and the Austrian, well, the Austro-German social democrats were really upset with the Slavic peoples of Austria-Hungary because the Czech peoples did not support the German struggle for the republic, whatever, because it turns out that the German struggle, because they saw the Bohemian lands and all the people there as part of Germany. And so, like, it's not just that there's a kind of simplified understanding of a historical category. It's also the case that at the time, there were people who were like, oh, that's fucking German chauvinism, of course.
Yeah.
It's tricky. It's muddy. It's both, but it's mostly just a misunderstanding, I think. And I have heard
because at a certain level, you have to have like the capacity to do this, and like certain nations are going to be in a more like real. I mean, even when you're talking about Czech people becoming a historical people because they held this like specific economic position. Like we're not talking about whether or not the nation has the will or the correct, like, I don't know, personality in order to get like to be a cooperative nation versus like a belligerent, or to be like, you know, only self-obsessed versus like, you know, involving itself at this higher level. It's just that like there are accidents of history which actually determine like the necessary steps that like follow from, like, given the historical situation you're in. But yeah, sorry, I cut you off there.
Oh, I mean, I agree. I'll leave it at that because maybe we should move on to the fucking third page of the second half of the chapter.
To be fair, I'm jumping way forward, and then we could drag that because I already jumped to the national hatred thing.
As long as we accept that the second half of chapter 3 needs to be finished today, so that when we all come back next time, it will be for chapter 4. Then I really don't care. Like, if we jump around, that's fine. Yeah. And also, like, I guess I wasn't paying attention to the fact that you jumped around because I read the last note from my notebook and I closed it, so I don't know where we are. So I'm just moving. Basically, I'm leaving it to the two of you to tell me where we are.
That's right. Well, we kind of just discussed page 220 because Bauer actually directly references Engels in his articles about historical nations. It was in the Nullrheinische Zeitung during the 1848 revolutions. Jason basically added all the context.
Did you say 220?
Yeah, 220.
Oh wow, I'm skipping way ahead. I'm like at 184 right now.
Well, that's where like his mention is of Engels like coining the term in those newspapers. But you basically just talked about everything that he mentions there on that page.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and like also like the awakening of self-consciousness of the lower classes now acquired a national significance in Austria, as did every social transformation. And then there are several pages just explaining that and contextualizing and proving it. But it's like that claim's been made, and most of it is just fleshing that out.
Yeah, I will say just again, I said this last episode, but I just want to reiterate it that like he does like try to prove all of this. Like he goes in and like pulls all these statistics out and like creates all these tables that are like look at the immigration patterns, look at the composition of labor within these specific regions, and now look at like what the legislation and the bureaucratic bodies were doing at the same time. And it's a very elegant way of like actually looking at history, I think, through a Marxist lens, which we don't get nowadays. And you know, I think part of this reading group has stated that the work that Bauer was doing is work that has largely been put down on the left, at least it seems to be, and it should be retaken up, and it should be retaken up in the way, and perhaps even improved, and however you could improve it, in the ways that Bauer himself tried to go into.
Yeah, I think that Bauer stands out as like an example par excellence of what it means to make a complex cultural argument for political purposes, backed up by history, by historical examples, and a knowledge of everything that happens as a result. Reading Bauer, I'm kind of reminded, like, oh, this is actually what an intellectual is supposed to be. Is this? And it's funny because
he's intellectually honest and rigorous, and like, I don't know, he has problems he wants to actually like deal with, and not just like hold a position in a university, you know.
Exactly. I like this passage. It's not actually about what we're talking about, but I'm going to use it that way anyways. It's on page 187. He says, what was being experienced by the Czech masses in the form of an only half understood mood was transformed in the minds of the intelligentsia into a clear idea and into a conscious desire. And I kind of think that's what Bauer is doing with this relatively chaotic and discordant sense of nationhood and all the weepy, misty-eyed aspects of it, and all the ways in which it can be dramatically misused and utilized for nefarious purposes. What Bauer's doing is he's saying this half-understood mood needs to be clarified and transformed into a conscious desire and into a clear idea. And I think that's precisely what he's doing. And that really it's a real shame that he's not much better known. And I think, honestly, if the 21st century is going to have a socialism worthy of the name, part of it's going to be dependent upon people at least learning how to be intellectuals like Bauer again.
I especially like the point, like, the clarification of ideas. Like, I think I've maybe brought it up before, but there's Spinoza has a distinction between adequate and inadequate ideas. And for him, an inadequate idea is one which is confused about the causes of the effects that people are experiencing. So, like, people are experiencing real, like, effects of, the historical situation that they're living in. And it produces like lots of confused experiences and reactions and understandings of what's going on. And the job of the intellectual in that, specifically like a politically involved intellectual in that situation, is to connect, those effects that are very confused, or of which people are very confused about their causes, and give like clarity and point to like the real causes of these effects. And of course, that's almost an interminable process. You're always going to be doing that. People are always going to have their passions and desires influencing like how they experience the effects of the social world that they live in. But I really do think, like, I don't know, I feel like a lot of like intellectual culture nowadays loses that. And like, I don't know, as somebody who does like Zizek or whatever, I don't know if he totally is somebody who's feels like his job is to clarify things. And I do think that there's something about like demystifying and giving clarity to ideas that I think is just necessary, especially like in navigating like very messy historical phenomena, that aren't very simple to do. I was listening to some, I don't even remember what podcast, but they offered a possible, I don't know, motto or Hippocratic oath, but for theorists to be do no mystification. And I do kind of like that. As like we really are, like, we want to give clarity to the ideas. Like, people already do see things. Like, even now, like, we can bitch about how like poorly read people are, and how engaged in like consumed in social media, and like everybody has infantile like political responses, and all that is true. But like the point is not to point and laugh or to like play around in the like confusion, but to actually try and like produce some sort of clarity within that.
Yeah, I mean that's an excellent point. I mean, if we don't do that, you're left with these reductive and necessarily counter-revolutionary understandings of the
Yeah.
world and all of its components that
If we
is
don't do
given
that, we
to you.
lose.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, to move it back to the book, something which Bauer mentions on page 188, just basically right after the passage we've just read, which is where he's talking about how, quote, up until this point, these strata had always become German through their German education. But now, however, their Czech national consciousness awakened within them. They were themselves revolutionary. They hated the German state, which gagged the freedom of thought. They hated the landed noble who looked down from his proud mansion with such contempt upon the poor country physician and the badly paid petty official. They hated the capitalist with that feeling of envy with which the poor intellectual so often confronts the pompous lack of education. And in their hatred for the German ruling stratum, they now began to feel a solidarity with the popular masses, which were pervaded by the same hatred. They began to recall their origins among these masses and to recall their nationality. One of the things that sort of sparked for me as I was reading it just now is the fact that once this sentiment has realized itself within a class of people, then you do need these intellectuals coming from the bottom on up, whether they're socialists or in this case just like nationalist intellectuals. That way you can turn that hatred that everyone is feeling into something that's actually constructive. Because I think too often, both on the left and in history, we see a lot of people who get really riled up. And as people get riled up, they do want to do something. But this is what we always talk about with like blind actionism, right? Is that if you just go out and you do stuff, whatever that stuff may be,
just do stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Like you're not targeting the specific things you should be targeting. And in trying to do actions that actually end in resolutions towards these things which got you angry to begin with, you have to have these people, whether they're internal to the movement or perhaps even external to it, who are like giving you the analysis in order to actually go after the things that are needed in order to change your conditions for the better.
Yeah, to go back and defend Zizek after just slandering him, I do totally take up his motto.
That's the only way to do it.
That is the only way to be Fidelitist to Zizek. But what do you call it? Where he has a motto: "Don't just act, think." And like 100% endorse that.
That's one of a Regrettable Century favorites. Zizek is I don't know. He's like 70% right, 30% wrong. 60-40, something like that.
The old dang judgment on Mao. And Mao's judgment on Stalin, right? Pretty sure they put 70-30.
I think it's 70-30, maybe it's 60-40. I don't really know. I mean, specifically with Zizek.
Yeah.
Because in the broad contours, he is extremely useful. But I vehemently disagree with a lot of his political positions. Philosophically, though, I feel like he's a necessary figure. Anyways, back to the book.
I think we can move us forward a little bit in that the 220s area where we were. That's where he starts introducing, and it's been like foreshadowed for a while, but the distinction between the centralist atomist and the personality principle as the two, like, what do you call it? I don't know, principles of nationhood, statehood, individuality within there, or subjecthood under the state. And I think we could see those as like two different ways of resolving like the dualistic antagonism of the state-estate system. So under the like centralist atomist, it is like there is the state, and then there are atomized individuals which make up the state. And I think, and this is where like with like Hobbes, he has a very like weird relationship with like liberalism, and also with like a lot of liberals don't want to deal with like the connection between absolutism and the logic of absolutism and liberalism. And I think it is precisely along this like line of the centralist atomist state. The force that had produced the centralist atomist idea of the state and decided its victory was the development of capitalist commodity production. Capitalist commodity production required neither the cooperative nor seniorial association. The social character of production no longer needed a cooperative of producers as soon as the large capitalist enterprise united the isolated workers as its workers in the work of society. The personal bondage of the workers became unnecessary from the moment capitalist property gave the owner the power to exploit the legally free worker. Cooperative and seniorial associations were thus rendered unnecessary and could disappear. And indeed, they had to disappear since they constituted a hindrance to the development of capitalism. The centralist atomist idea of the state was initially the absolutist conception of the state, and subsequently that of liberalism. It was both because it constitutes the capitalist idea of the state.
I think there's only one thing I want to make sure that just to say about the Sophiology that we skipped ahead.
Yeah.
It's just it's worth reading that, like in close to reading everything. If you're a listener and if you're trying to read along, because the description of 1848 and everything that happened as a result and everything leading up to it is just really worth digging into and learning.
Mm-hmm.
It's worth learning how a people of oppressed peasants and servants, which regarded its language with shame, had become a nation with a with a considerably broad stratum of intellectuals and prosperous petty bourgeois members who had become conscious of their nationality and were pervaded by a lively national sentiment. That, I don't want to go into all the details of everything about the reawakening, the second historical status of the Czech nation, but it's beautifully written and it's just very much worth going into. Now, all that being said, what Trent had previously just said was really much more important.
Well, to the listeners, listening to this podcast is not a substitute for reading the damn book. You gotta read the book also.
That's right.
But yeah, and so the centralist atomist is from the beginning. It was introduced I think even in the preface it was there, but definitely in the introduction, is basically contrasted with the personality principle. Let me see if I can find a good definition of that. But I think personality principle would be much more at this intermediate level, like all the different cooperative associations and different guilds or unions or whatever civil society institutions that exist in between the poles of the state and the individual, and really gives those primacy in how we define ourselves, which the nation would be one of these sorts of like intermediate things. I think especially for how Bauer defines it. It is like the nation exists between like in this mediating layer between the state and the individual. But that's not all. It isn't only within this specific pole, but it also is like the nation isn't only defined as what is between the individual and the state, because that would actually be capitulating to the nation state, model as like one nation, one state as like a thing. I think that's a big thing. Like the personality principle is much more about all these various different associations in which one involves themselves as being determinate of like how they identify with a certain nation.
I mean, I think it's worth, again, for the listener, spending some time on just understanding traditional social associations and how, what does he say? Absolutism could not constitute the nations as corporations. And that don't mean like corporations as in private firms. I don't mean corporations like fucking LNG or whatever. Like,
well, in the sense of corporatism, right?
Right. But rather, absolutism was concerned with smashing the old traditional social associations in order to confront an unorganized mass of subjects with the centralized power of the state. Liberalism now inherited this centralist atomist conception. It also did not constitute the nation as a corporation. I feel like that's a really important. Something important to tarry with. Is like, in order to fully develop the capitalist nation, the nation state rather, the capitalist state, it meant a shattering and scattering of the old corporate structures of social institutions in order to create this centralist atomist position in the first place.
Yeah, because the opposing viewpoint that he brings up right above, I believe the paragraph that Trent had read, is that Rudolf Springer conceived of the nation state as like being one of two different compositions. You have the centralist atomist state, which to your point, Jason, that like destroying, I think, is just like the atomist component of it, right? So everybody has become atomized and is now subject to this centralized apparatus. Whereas he also gives this organic regulation or conception of the state,